Welcome. Today, Carl Jung, a biographical journey into the depths. Enjoy.
He was born on July 26, 1875, in Keswill, a quiet village on the Swiss lakes. His father was a Protestant pastor. His mother came from a family where stories of dreams and spirits still moved in the evenings. Between church and night, reason and mystery, the child learned that the world had two faces. Carl Jung grew up solitary, intensely observant, drawn more to stones, rivers, and books than to games in the street. He sensed, early, a split inside himself. Later he would give it names: personality number 1, the schoolboy of the 19th century, dutiful and practical, and personality number 2, an older presence, ancient, reflective, as if he had lived before. This was not play acting to him. It was the felt architecture of his inner life. There were dreams, vivid, strange, sometimes frightening, that did not feel like inventions. They arrived from below, with symbols he did not yet understand. He learned to watch them without panic, as a fisherman watches the line. What others called imagination, he treated as data. What others dismissed as fantasy, he stored away like evidence. The family moved to Lofton near the thunder of the Rhine Falls. His father struggled with faith. Questions that could not be resolved at the pulpit drifted across the dinner table. Carl saw, not the certainty of religion, but the psychology of belief, the way the soul carries conviction, doubt, and hope. At school he performed well enough, but his true classroom was the inner one. He read widely, history, philosophy, natural science, and sensed that the human mind was not a narrow hallway of instincts but an entire cathedral with a crypt beneath. He was not social in the fashionable way. Solitude became a workshop. He carved out small rituals of thought, kept private notebooks, and trained his attention on the tensions most people avoid: light and shadow, faith and skepticism, waking and the realm of dreams. He felt, without yet proving, that these opposites belonged to a single system. By adolescence he had developed a habit that would mark his life. When faced with a puzzle, he did not push it away, he descended. He allowed the question to gather images until it spoke. He didn't yet have the word symbol or archetype, but the pattern was already forming: images first, then concepts, experience first, then theory. At the University of Basel he chose medicine, less out of love for the scalpel than for a larger curiosity: what is a human being? Anatomy gave him structures, pathology gave him failures, neither gave him the secret. That, he suspected, was hidden where medicine was most uncertain, in the mind. Psychiatry, still a young and often neglected field, looked to others like a backwater. To Jung it looked like the frontier. He would soon arrive in Zurich, at the Bergallslee Hospital, where the new science of the psyche was being forged. But the essential map was already sketched: a boy between church and night, a watcher of dreams, a divided self seeking unity. Before he ever met Freud, before he named the collective unconscious, the road had already bent toward the depths. At the turn of the century Jung arrived in Zurich, drawn to the Bergallslee, one of Europe's rare laboratories of the mind. The director, Eugen Bleuler, treated madness not as a moral failure but as a phenomenon to be studied, measured, and understood. Jung stepped into the wards with a notebook in his hand and a conviction he could not yet name, that even disordered speech might carry a hidden order. The patients were not abstractions to him. They were men and women caught in storms of thought, hallucinations that felt more vivid than daylight, silence as heavy as iron, gestures that looked like rituals nobody else could interpret. Jung listened. He cataloged phrases, pauses, slips, and sudden jolts of emotion. He suspected that the psyche, even when fractured, remained purposeful. It spoke in images when it could not speak in ordinary words. From that suspicion came work that made his name. He refined the word association test into a tool with teeth. A clinician would read a neutral list of words: mother, water, money, death, and the patient would respond with the first thought that surfaced. Jung recorded not only the answers but the reaction times, the hesitations, the changes in pulse and breathing. A too long pause, a repeated error, a tremor on a particular word, these were signposts pointing to an unseen center of gravity. He called it a feeling tone complex, an emotional nucleus around which ideas, memories, and behaviors organize themselves, out of sight of waking intention. This was more than clever testing. It was a demonstration that the unconscious is active. It resists, it hides, it protects, it compensates. In the clinic, he could often infer the story before hearing it: the father whose presence weighed like a law, the humiliation that split a life in two, the forbidden wish that still moved the strings. Complexes, he argued, were not mere obstacles, they were living systems inside the psyche. They could cripple, and they could also, if understood, point the way to meaning. Jung wrote with the zeal of discovery. Papers accumulated, case studies became arguments, arguments hardened into books. In his study on what was then called dementia praecox, later named schizophrenia, he insisted that psychotic imagery was not random debris. The strange phrases, the private myths, the terrifying visions, they bore the structure of symbols. Even at the far edge of breakdown, the human mind tried to speak its truth through images. He read widely to make sense of those images: mythology, medieval alchemy, comparative religion. He began to see that the inner language of his patients echoed stories far older than any personal biography. The clinical day fed the night of study, the motifs repeated: the devouring mother, the wrathful father, the hero swallowed and reborn. Slowly, the outline of a larger idea appeared, that the psyche carries inherited patterns of imagination. Around this time, he encountered a book that struck like a tuning fork: Freud's interpretation of dreams. Here was a physician who also believed that symptoms had meaning and that dreams were not noise but messages. Jung wrote to Freud. A correspondence began. In 1907, they met in Vienna and spoke for 13 hours straight. The intensity of that first conversation became legend. Each felt confirmed by the other, a companion at last in a field where most colleagues still preferred the microscope to the dream. The alliance transformed Jung's standing. He became one of Freud's closest collaborators, the brilliant younger colleague from Switzerland whose clinical experiments seemed to give psychoanalysis a physiological backbone. Lectures followed, journals, an expanding circle of adherents and opponents. In 1909, when Freud journeyed to Clark University in the United States to present psychoanalysis to an American audience, Jung traveled with him. The trip carried the feeling of a movement crossing the ocean. Honorary degrees were given, doors that had been closed opened a fraction. At Berghalsli and beyond, Jung's personal life anchored the work. He married Emma Rauschenbach, whose independence of mind and patience would sustain and challenge him for decades. Their home became a meeting place for arguments that ran late into the night, about science and spirit, about what counts as knowledge when the subject is the soul. Yet the very force that united Freud and Jung, an insistence that the mind's depths could be mapped, also revealed their difference. For Freud, libido was principally sexual energy, religion and myth were disguises woven by desire. For Jung, libido felt broader, a general life force that could crystallize as sexuality, creativity, ambition, or spiritual longing. Where Freud saw the gods as projections, Jung began to wonder whether the gods were patterns through which human experience finds form. He did not yet break ranks. He argued, he refined, he tried to translate. But the tension widened with every paper he wrote, with every patient whose dreams seemed to pull not only toward childhood but toward something impersonal and ancient. In lecture halls, he spoke the language of the new psychoanalysis. In his notebooks, he sketched a map that reached further back, into the strata of myth. By the end of this period, Jung stood at a crossroads, internationally recognized, appointed to leadership in the psychoanalytic movement, and at the same time pulled by a current he could no longer ignore. The next step would cost him friendships, security, and nearly his sanity. But it would also open the path that made him Carl Jung. By 1911, the alliance between Freud and Jung was both official and fragile. Jung had been named the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, a sign that the future of the movement, to many, wore a Swiss face. But beneath the titles, a slow tectonic shift was underway. Their letters, once electric with discovery, grew denser, more guarded, more insistent that the other yield ground. The issue was not a small technical point. It was the center of gravity. For Freud, the psyche turned around sexuality, the mythologies of culture were disguises for desire. For Jung, libido felt wider, a current of life that could become sexual but also religious, creative, or destructive. Where Freud saw dreams as wish fulfillments, Jung increasingly saw them as messages from a deeper strata that was not only personal but, he dared to think, collective. In 1912, Jung published the book that made the rift unavoidable, Wandlungen und die Symbole der Libido, later known as Symbols of Transformation. It traced how myths and dreams move through the human mind, not merely as masks of forbidden wishes, but as formative patterns that guide development. He compared clinical material with ancient stories, heroes swallowed and reborn, gods that die and rise, and concluded that the psyche speaks an archaic language inherited across generations. To Freud, the argument felt like defection from science into mysticism. To Jung, it felt like an honest report from the clinic and from his own inner life. The personal did not spare the theoretical. Jung's relationship with the brilliant patient and later analyst Sabina Spielrein, complex, ethically fraught, and intellectually vital, added heat to suspicions. The friendship wounded his marriage and unsettled the movement. In the corridors of psychoanalysis, people began to choose sides. The correspondence hardened. Freud warned him, almost like a father, that speculation about myth and religion would dissolve psychoanalysis into fog. Jung replied that to deny the symbolic life of the psyche was to amputate its most powerful organ. In public they maintained respect, in private each felt betrayed. The man Jung had admired as a pioneer began to look, in his eyes, like a dogmatist. The student Freud had anointed began to look, in Freud's eyes, like a heretic. In 1913 the break became public. Jung resigned from editorships, stepped back from Freud's inner circle, and watched friendships fall away like scaffolding. The loss was not academic, it was existential. He had tied his reputation, and much of his identity, to a movement that suddenly no longer wanted him. The praise of yesterday turned into silence, then criticism. He returned to Kuznach with Emma and their children, outwardly secure, inwardly unmoored. That autumn, as if the outer break had cracked open an inner vault, the visions began. On a train across Europe he saw, with the force of reality, a flood pouring across the continent, fields drowned, cities submerged, a sea of blood rising to the Alps. It was not a dream, it happened as he stared out the window, awake. Other images followed, frozen lands, rivers turned red, a monstrous tree with human eyes. He feared he was sliding into schizophrenia, the very illness whose patterns he studied at Bergallslee. Jung did not flee. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would face the images and learn their language. He began to keep small black notebooks, records of dreams, fantasies, dialogues with figures that appeared unbidden. He would hold an image in attention until it deepened, then ask it a question, then another, and write down whatever came. He later called the method active imagination. At the time it felt like stepping off the map. Outside, Europe crept toward catastrophe. Inside, Jung entered a private war. He suspended most of his lectures and reduced his clinical work. He carved time each day to descend, to sketch, to color, to argue with presences he could not yet classify. He built small stone figures by the lake, as if the hands could anchor what the mind could not. When doubt seized him, he tested himself with ordinary tasks, reading the train schedule, doing sums, just to make sure reality still held. In August 1914, war erupted. The flood of blood he had seen now poured across newspapers and telegrams. To Jung, this did not prove that he was a prophet. It proved something more important to him, that the images arising from the depths were objective in their own way, connected to the fate of the time. His fear of madness loosened. He had not fallen into illness, he had entered a territory for which modern psychology had no name. The cost remained. To colleagues he looked like a man who had abandoned the scientific road. To friends he looked withdrawn, absorbed by something he would not explain. To himself he looked like a traveler with no companion, compelled to map a continent that resisted maps. Yet a structure was forming. The notes in the black books grew into illuminated pages, text and image, calligraphy and mandala, a work of art as much as a record. He would soon begin to copy and amplify those entries into a great red volume, a codex of his descent. The movement he had lost offered one kind of authority, the book he was about to write would offer another. The break with Freud had left Jung standing on bare ground. In that exposure he discovered a door. He turned the handle and stepped through. What he found there became the heart of his psychology and the heart of his life. In the winter after the break, Jung did something few physicians would dare. He turned his clinical lens inward. He set aside hours each day, not to theorize, but to descend. He opened a black notebook and wrote whatever came from below, scenes, dialogues, images that rose with the force of weather. If an image appeared, a desert, a cave, a stranger, he did not dismiss it as only imagination. He stepped into it, asked it questions, and waited for answers. Later he would call this method active imagination. At the time it felt like walking into a forest at night with a single candle. Figures arrived. An old prophet named Elijah, a young woman, Salome, a serpent that spoke, a giant called Isdabar, out of Near Eastern myth, and, above all, a winged old man with the calm of the sea, Philemon, who became a teacher inside the imaginal world. Jung sketched them in pencil, then ink, then color. He treated them not as characters he invented but as autonomous presences within the psyche. They know things I do not know, he would later say. The scientist in him watched, the traveler in him listened. The notebooks filled quickly, what we now call the Black Books, 1913 to 1916. Out of them he began, in 1915, a work unlike any modern psychological text, a large crimson volume, hand-bound, into which he copied, reworked, and illuminated the visions. He wrote in calligraphy, as if composing a medieval manuscript. He painted mandalas, deserts, towers, floods, gods and devils, birds and suns. He titled it Liber Novus, the New Book, known to us as the Red Book. It was not meant for publication. It was a private record of a descent that nearly broke him and remade him. War raged across Europe while Jung's inner war unfolded in Küsnacht. By day he kept up a reduced clinical practice, lectured occasionally, and fulfilled duties that tethered him to ordinary life. By night he entered the book. He discovered that the psyche is not a mechanism waiting for instructions, it is a living landscape with its own climate and inhabitants. When he tried to command it, it resisted. When he approached it with attention and humility, it answered with symbols. One figure crystallized the lesson, Philemon, the wise old man with kingfisher wings and horns of a bull in Jung's painting, taught him that thoughts can be spirits and that the imagination is a realm, neither mere fantasy nor external fact, but something in between and real in its own order. Philemon's counsel shaped Jung's ethics of the inner life. Do not identify with the figures, do not worship them, do not suppress them. Converse with them, and let meaning emerge from the tension between your conscious view and what the images demand. From this dialogue Jung derived a principle he later named the transcendent function. When opposed tendencies in the psyche, reason and image, will and impulse, light and shadow, are held together without premature victory, a third thing can appear, a symbol that transcends the opposition and points the way forward. The psyche heals not by erasing conflict, but by giving it form. The Red Book also seeded a vocabulary that would shape his mature psychology. He saw that dreams and visions often resembled mythic patterns not explainable by personal memory alone. He began to speak of archetypes, recurring forms of imagination that structure human experience, and of a collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche shared by the species. These were not dogmas to him but empirical in the broad sense, repeatable patterns observed across patients, cultures, and his own visions. In 1916, at the height of this period, another text erupted, the Seven Sermons to the Dead, written under the ancient name Basilides of Alexandria. In the story, the dead thronged his house, hungry for teaching. The sermons answered with stark images, the pleroma, abraxas, the union of opposites, ideas too raw for the academic journals of his day. Jung circulated the pages only to close friends. He was not evangelizing, he was documenting a pressure that demanded speech. The cost remained high. He doubted himself. He feared professional ruin and private collapse. He tested his sanity with simple tasks, reading schedules, doing sums, to be sure he still stood on common ground. Emma Jung's steadiness, and the presence of their children, formed a domestic horizon within which the descent could unfold. He built tiny stone structures by the lake, as if to anchor the invisible in weight and shape. He learned that play, serious, childlike play, opens doors reason cannot. Page by page, the Red Book became a map of individuation, not yet fully named, but lived, the long process by which a person becomes who they are by encountering what they are not. The encounters were sometimes terrifying. He met cruelty in himself, pride, hunger for power. He met also tenderness and a wisdom that did not come from his conscious plans. He did not preach self-improvement. He recorded transformation as it actually happens, through symbol, sacrifice, and the slow integration of what we would rather exclude. When the worst of the inner storm had passed, Jung did not claim sainthood or final knowledge. He claimed a method and a responsibility. The method, to pay attention to the language of images and to work with them, through drawing, writing, movement, voice, until a symbol mediates between conscious life and the depths. The responsibility, not to drown in the images or to deny them, but to give them a place in life so that they do not seize it from below. He continued to copy and paint the Red Book into the 1920s, then set it aside, unfinished but complete in spirit. He locked it away. To colleagues he offered the publishable fruit, the essays on complexes, on the unconscious, on types. To the book he entrusted the furnace in which those ideas had been forged. Decades later he would say that everything of importance in his later work had been anticipated there. The world would not see the Red Book until 2009, long after his death. But the man who emerged from its pages in the late 1910s was no longer the young lieutenant of a movement or the obedient son of the 19th century. He was something rarer, a physician who had mapped his own underworld and returned with a grammar for the rest of us, though he would insist that each person must walk a different path. From the red pages Jung stepped back into the outer world, ready to build in daylight what he had discovered at night, a psychology capacious enough for science and symbol, clinic and myth. The next chapters of his life would give those discoveries public form. Emerging from the Red Book years, Jung began the harder task, turning ordeal into language. He needed terms sturdy enough for daylight, precise enough for clinics, yet wide enough to hold what had broken through. Two ideas took shape, archetypes and the collective unconscious, and with them a map of the deep. First, a distinction. The personal unconscious contains what biographical life forgets, represses, or never quite brings into focus: childhood scenes, private conflicts, unlived wishes. But beneath that, Jung proposed, lies a second stratum, the collective unconscious. It is not a storehouse of inherited memories, not a museum of pictures passed down like heirlooms. It is a structure, a set of organizing patterns, forms without specific content, that the human psyche brings to experience, wherever and whenever it lives. Call these organizing patterns archetypes. They are the deep grammars of imagination. They guide how images form, how stories bend, how conflicts stage themselves. In Clinic and Steady, Jung kept seeing the same shapes: the hero who descends and returns, the great mother who nurtures and devours, the wise old man who counsels and deceives, the trickster who breaks order to renew it. Patients who had never read the old tales still dreamed them. The symbols were not imported from books. The books had recognized patterns already active in the soul. Among the archetypes he named, several became central to his psychology of the person. The persona, the mask we present to the world, allows society to function. It also hides. The shadow, all that the conscious identity disowns, contains what we fear and need. The anima, in a man, and animus, in a woman, the inner contrasexual figures, mediate between ego and the depths. They can enchant, mislead, and guide. And beyond these stood the figure he called the self, not the ego expanded, but the ordering center and circumference of the whole psyche, the image of psychic totality that draws a life toward individuation. Archetypes do not appear naked. They arrive as symbols, living images that hold opposites together. A mandala, with its centered circle and fourfold balance, often rose in Jung's patients during periods of upheaval, as if the psyche were sketching its own medicine. A serpent, coiling and shedding, might signal danger or renewal, or both. A tower, a tree, a river, each could constellate when a life needed a form for what words could not yet carry. To Jung, a symbol was not a code with one fixed answer. It was a process that grows meaning as one lives with it. Clinically, this changed the aim of treatment. The point was not to silence symptoms as quickly as possible or to reduce every image to a childhood scene. The point was to listen for what the psyche was attempting. A nightmare could be a compensation for a lopsided day world. A compulsion might be a crude attempt to force ritual where meaning had collapsed. If a patient could enter dialogue with the image through drawing, movement, association, or simply sustained attention, another possibility could emerge. Jung called this the transcendent function. When opposites are held without premature victory, a third thing forms, a bridge, a next step. To give his colleagues a framework for differences in consciousness itself, he outlined psychological types, the broad attitudes of introversion and extroversion, and the four primary functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, by which we orient to reality. This was no parlor typology to him, it was a clinical tool. If doctor and patient worked from opposed types, misunderstanding would multiply. If one function dominated a life, its neglected opposite would return from below, often in symptomatic form. Typology described the surface currents, archetypes mapped the depths. Jung knew how easily these ideas could be misused, as dogma, as excuse, as mythology mistaken for literal history. He argued again and again, archetypes are tendencies, not templates. The collective unconscious is shared structure, not destiny. He was a physician first. The proof lay in whether a symbol, rightly understood, restored orientation and meaning to a disoriented life. Outside the study, he kept testing the universality of these patterns. He read myths and scriptures, medieval visions and folk tales. He compared patients' drawings with ancient motifs and found parallels that surprised even him. The convergence did not make him a mystic in the pejorative sense, it made him a comparativist of the soul. If the same shapes keep appearing in different centuries and languages, perhaps they belong not to any one culture but to the architecture of being human. By the early 1920s, Jung had translated his descent into a psychology capacious enough to include science and story, clinic and ritual, the measured test and the midnight vision. The man who had walked into the underworld now returned with tools. Soon he would build places and friendships to house this work, stone by stone, book by book, carrying the images from the red pages into a life lived in daylight. The next chapter would widen the circle, travels, towers, friendships, and the slow public unfolding of a private discovery. Out of the red book years, Jung turned deliberately toward daylight. He kept his clinic in Kuznacht, mended friendships where he could, and began to build his outer life in stone. In 1923, on the shore of Lake Zurich, he laid the first courses of a small round house that would grow in stages into the Bollingen Tower, a living diagram of his psychology. Each edition marked a phase of work. Inscriptions in Latin and Greek ring the walls. Inside, mandalas bloom in pigment and chiseled glyphs. When words failed, stone spoke. Two women shaped the rhythm of those decades. Emma Jung, partner and rigorous thinker, steadied the household and pursued her own scholarship on the Grail. Tony Wolfe, a former patient who became a close collaborator, challenged and amplified his ideas. Their bond was controversial, complex, and intellectually fertile. The arrangement wounded and sustained the circle around him. It also left its trace in his insight into anima, animus, love, and loyalty. He traveled to widen the map. In New Mexico, conversations with Taos Pueblo people impressed upon him a different center of life, less head, more heart, more cosmos. In East Africa, he felt the pull of myth in open landscapes and ritual. In India, he studied texts and symbols whose symmetry echoed his patients' drawings. These journeys did not make him an anthropologist. They confirmed a conviction that the psyche speaks a language older than any one culture, and that symbols migrate because the forms that receive them are shared. The 1920s and 30s brought the work into public shape. Psychological Types, 1921, set out the broad attitudes of introversion and extroversion and the four functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, a practical scaffolding for clinical work and ordinary life. Seminars in Zurich filled with analysts and artists. Beginning in 1933, he lectured at Eranos, the annual gathering in Ascona founded by Olga Frobkaptian, where comparative religion, myth, and psychology could share a table. There he exchanged ideas with historians, philologists, and physicists, including Wolfgang Pauli, with whom he later explored the idea he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that is not reducible to cause and effect. The decade also brought peril. As Europe darkened, Jung accepted positions meant to keep psychotherapy international and non-sectarian. The politics around these roles drew criticism and suspicion. He rejected racial ideology in print and in practice, defended colleagues under pressure, and also made statements that would be argued over long after the war. He preferred, whenever possible, to return to the clinic and to the tower, where symbols, not slogans, governed the work. In 1944, illness struck. A heart attack and a prolonged convalescence brought visions of flight, distant Earth, and luminous figures, images he later described carefully, as a doctor who would not confuse metaphor with measurement but would also not lie about what he had seen. Recovery was slow. The late books followed: Ion, 1951, On the Self and the Shadow in Christian Symbolism, Answer to Job, 1952, a storm of a book that forced readers to stare at the problem of evil, and The Long Labor of Mysterium Conscientiae, 1955-56, where he read medieval alchemy as a symbolic psychology of transformation. Visitors came to Küsnacht and Bollingen, patients, students, skeptics, admirers. He lectured less, carved more, and maintained the daily discipline that had carried him through earlier extremes: read, write, walk, attend to dreams, answer letters, shape stone. What he had wrestled from the depths in youth he now curated for the time left to him, fitting pages and people into a pattern that could outlast a single life. By the 1950s he had become, against his intentions, a figure of culture as well as a physician, photographed at the tower, quoted out of context, sought by those who needed healing and those who wanted a myth. He continued to insist on the ordinary truth: symbols matter because lives do. The task is to find a form in which a human being can stand. By the late 1950s, Jung had become a paradox, a private man whose work spilled into public life. He disliked celebrity, yet his terms, introvert and extrovert, archetype and shadow, escaped the clinic and entered everyday speech. In 1948, his students founded the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, a place to train analysts in the work he had wrestled from the depths. Seminars continued, letters multiplied, stone accumulated at Bollingen, where the tower recorded time more honestly than calendars could. He wrote steadily to the end. Ion probed the symbol of the self in Christian history. Answer to Job forced a confrontation with evil that few psychologists would risk. Mysterium Conscientiae read medieval alchemy as a map of psychic transformation. With the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, he pursued the vexing idea of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that refuses to be reduced to mechanics. The vocabulary was not decoration, it was an attempt to give modern people a grammar for experiences they were already having and no longer knew how to name. In 1961, at his home in Küsnacht, Jung died on June 6, after 85 years of watching the mind from the inside. He was buried in the local cemetery, not far from the lake that had anchored so many walks. The following year, friends and family published memories, dreams, reflections, shaped from conversations with Anila Jaffe, a portrait of a life seen through the very lens he had taught, where outer events and inner images reflect one another across a veil. Decades later, in 2009, the sealed Red Book appeared, and readers could see the furnace in which the published ideas were forged, the visions, dialogues, and mandalas that made theory answer to experience. Jung's influence widened along paths he did not plan. His typology inspired later instruments in business and education. His work with images seeded art therapy. His comparative reading of myth and religion entered literature, film, and religious studies. Analysts built institutes, critics argued with him, patients and readers found language for what had been only pressure and dream. Through it all, his insistence remained: the psyche is not a machine to be optimized, but a living system that seeks form. Healing begins when we face what we have banished and allow the symbol to mediate between our daylight and our depths. He did not offer a map that fits everyone. He offered a way to travel: attention, dialogue with the image, patience for the union of opposites. The rest, he believed, is the work of a lifetime. Jung's path did not end here. In Carl Jung, Into the Shadows of the Unconscious, a psychological biography, the descent becomes method, where the red book opens onto archetypes, individuation, and the self. The deeper map awaits.
Carl Gustav Jung, truly a physician of the soul. Thank you for watching.